Also, copies of the 2023 calendar, which we still got a few months left in 2023, and the photos in there are wonderful. So help yourself to those, bookmarks, historic slides of Humboldt County photos. And of course, if anybody here is not a member of the Historical Society, we've got membership forms and also the QR code you can scan to get to our membership page of the website. So definitely want to encourage everybody to help yourself to stuff over there before you leave today. Please let me go home with a smaller amount of that stuff than I came with. And please do join the society if you're not already members. So thanks again for being here.
All right, thank you, Alex. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get right into it. First thing we'll talk about is Eureka's historic Chinese population. Part of that is determining where people were living. So if you're familiar with this stretch of 101, this is 101 South, right near Old Town, also known as 4th Street. And if you're looking east towards the traffic, like this image, this is what you would end up seeing if you stop in the middle of the road, for instance, and take a look. The Clark Museum is off the screen about a block to the left. Coast Central is shown kind of in the right there. And then the Fowl mural, which has the big duck on it, is off the screen also to the right. So back in the 1880s, this street scene would have looked like this. So this is a colorized image of Eureka's Chinatown. The reveals kind of some interesting information, not only about the Chinatown, but about the records that we have on Chinatown. So you'll notice around the edges, there's kind of some descriptions of some of the other buildings that are around. And it kind of promotes an Americanized gaze looking at this location. So there's not much mention of the Chinese who lived there, besides something like at the bottom, Chinese houses, Chinese homes on the bottom. But it spends a lot more time focusing on the American businesses that are nearby. And so let's take a closer look at this image. I have a couple arrows here. The first arrow on the far left of the image, that's pointing at a scaffolding that was likely mounted on top of a building. It was used to dry laundry in a Chinese-owned laundry. When you take a much closer look at this image that I'm able to do right now, there are signs that indicate that there was a laundry there. And it was called Tung Sing Laundry. The second arrow from the left indicates a shop sign, says Sing Yek. It's kind of hard to see in this image, but we have other ones that are kind of more zoomed in. And then there's another store across the street. There's a third arrow. And that is Conhua, which is likely located near another shop which we have more information on called Kang Hop Company, which is kind of a general store. These shops were located across the street from Centennial Hall, which is further back in the image and is indicated at the top of the picture. That building, kind of funny enough, was built to celebrate the anniversary of the centennial of the United States. But there's kind of some stuff that went down there that we'll talk about later that has kind of not as nice vibes. A building, yeah, we'll talk more about that. The last arrow, which is on the far right, shows a spot where you can kind of see the road has kind of a weird divot in it. And that is a key part of the landscape that shapes a lot of the story we're going to be talking about today. And we'll get right to it. So talking more about the people that lived here. So one record that we have is the 1880 census for Eureka and the surrounding areas. One thing about records pertaining to the Chinese residents, and I kind of mentioned it kind of earlier with the image, is that a lot of these records are incomplete when it comes to identifying the role of the Chinese. There's a lot of information missing. I mean, basic information as much as names, ages, addresses, things like that. Things are incomplete, things are biased, sometimes things are just outright incorrect, riddled with misspellings. You know, there's definitely a bit of a language barrier between Chinese and English. And so that can make it really hard or even impossible to track individuals over a period of time. And also, census data then, as well as now, is not always complete. So when you're doing a census, you're not generally able to capture every single person. There's usually an undercount. And when you're dealing with populations like the Chinese, there's people that are not counted for one reason or another. They might not have been in the area when the counts were taking place. They might have just been left out. There's a lot of reasons for it. But the census is still an important data source for us to use when figuring out the Chinese living in Eureka. It's kind of one of the only sources we have. So it's still important, but we compare it with other sources that are in archives and collections to create more full of an image. And actually, I won't click through it here, but we'll try to make this slideshow available. So if you want to actually click through some of these records that have been transcribed, you can do that. There's also a website called Family Search. If you figure out how to use it, you can sort the records as well. So that's pretty cool. That's like Ancestry, but free. That's pretty cool. So I went through these records and kind of made some graphs to kind of give you a larger image of what is in the 1880 census. So this is looking at the distribution of ages of Chinese residents in 1880. You can see that there's kind of this bulk of ages between 14-ish and 42. That's kind of in line with a lot of other immigrant populations that were coming to California, kind of on the younger side of things. But it's pretty stark to notice how there are almost no children. There's kind of just maybe like one. And that's, something we'll talk about. Okay, so this is looking at the sexes of the Chinese residents. They were overwhelmingly male, which is pretty common not only here, but in other parts of California. There were laws like the Page Act that passed that made it almost impossible for Chinese women to immigrate to the United States. So this is a great example of on the ground how that act played out. So between, there's 88% male, 11-ish% female. And now this is looking at occupations of the Chinese residents. So what kind of work were they doing while they lived here? So this is combined men and women. And you can see, the variety of different jobs. One thing about particularly earlier censuses is that there is not a whole lot of standardization in job titles. So sometimes there might be some things where you're like, well, that's kind of the same job. I don't know why it's showing up twice. This was all, hand-done census records. So you'd say, what's your job? And then they'd tell you and you'd write it down. There were also some misspellings like logger. That is probably supposed to be logger. I left it as it was. But it's really interesting to see just all the different kinds of work that people were doing. But when you look at the types of jobs, they're kind of similar, like service-based jobs. But there are some interesting ones like bookkeeper that you might not see otherwise. So this was really exciting when I did the little Excel thing. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Technology. One occupation that for some reason didn't show up in the 1880 census, and this could be just based on the location of where this work took place, is that of farmer. But from other records and sources, we do know that there were Chinese farmers in Eureka. So this is an image from Cal Poly Humboldt's Humboldt Room, Special Collections. And the description is just Chinese man Eureka, or Chinese farmer Eureka. We don't know who he is. We don't know where exactly in Eureka this was taken. But we do know that there were Chinese farmers around kind of the Hillsdale area, so Hillsdale Street, where those really fancy Victorians are. There were farms out there, and there were Chinese farmers out there, which is really cool. And they supplied a large amount of the fruits and vegetables and even maybe some of the livestock that people in Eureka were using. And not just Chinese people, the other white residents as well, relied a lot on these farmers for their fresh produce. And these farms were called truck farms because they would truck the vegetables kind of to different parts of town and sell them. Let's see. So Eureka was becoming, so this is the 1880s, Eureka is becoming increasingly urbanized. People might live in houses, but they might not have a lot of property to grow their own fruits and vegetables. So that's part of the reason why these Chinese farmers played a really important role. And actually, I think now I'm going to turn it over to Alex Service to talk about some of your research with the Chinese residents in Eureka, and just let me know when you want me to change the slide.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I introduce you.
Oh, sure.
Just so you know who's speaking, Dr. Alex Service is a prominent local historian. As she mentioned, she's the president of the board of directors of the Humboldt County Historical Society and the curator of the Fortuna Depot Museum. She earned a bachelor's degree in East Asian Studies from UCLA in 1993, and her MA and PhD in Medieval Studies from the University of York in England. She has published several excellent articles on various aspects of the lives of Chinese and Japanese people in Northern California, with recent articles in the Humboldt Historian and the North Coast Journal, which I encourage you all to read. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. All right, so one of the things that I've been trying to figure out in recent research is what we can track down about actual lives and identities of some of these Chinese people who lived in Humboldt County at the time of the expulsion in the mid-1880s. And of course, a lot of it is very, very difficult. It's one of these needle in a haystack type things, just searching for any kind of clue, any kind of hint one can find as to these people's identities and experiences. And one of the things that I've been doing a lot recently is searches via the California Digital Newspaper Collection and also newspapers.com, doing searches under Chinese from Eureka, all of that kind of thing, just trying to see whatever is going to come up. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about two individuals that I've been seeing larger glimpses of in this recent research. And the first one I want to talk about is known to us in newspaper accounts only as Mrs. Li Ah-hin. And the way I found her is by doing a search of Chinese from Eureka, and found this San Francisco, Examiner, I think, article from April of 1885. So now the date of the article is almost 3 months after the majority of the Chinese people of Eureka were expelled from this city in February of 1885. And it mentions that she is, a recent arrival from Eureka. Now, that doesn't say she's one of the people who was expelled, but with it being not quite 3 months after the expulsion, it seemed like a pretty good guess that she might have been among the expelled people. And the numbers of those people, it's a little uncertain as to exactly how many were expelled in February of 1885, but it was probably right around 310 people. Their newspaper accounts saying that there were 175 people on one ship and 135 on another. So it's my guess that she might have been one of these 310 people. Now, this article, let's see, yes, as you'll notice from the headlines, it's claiming that she's not Chinese. It's saying basically she's too good looking, she can't possibly be Chinese, she has to be a white woman. And she is persisting in declaring herself to be a Chinese. And we can go to the next slide, which is starting with more from this newspaper article, and I'll read you some excerpts from that. So it's describing her as Mrs. Li Ah-hin, a recent arrival from Eureka, who occupies a room with her husband on the second floor of number 924 DuPont Street. Now that's in San Francisco's Chinatown, and that's the street which would later be renamed Grant Avenue. So again, is calling her a recent arrival from Eureka, and then it describes her. She is perfect in features, and a single glance at her face is sufficient to proclaim that not a drop of Chinese blood courses through her veins, and this notwithstanding the disguising effect of the loose robes and trousers and headdress peculiar to the women with whom she is associated. Now, the address, 924 DuPont Street, the other image that I've got up there is a detail from an 1885 map of San Francisco's Chinatown, which is an absolute fabulous resource. It's a wonderful thing. You can find it just going online, doing a search of 1885 Chinatown map, that kind of thing. And it's extremely detailed. Of course, the reason it exists is because various San Francisco civic authorities were looking into the question of whether the Chinese people were a problem and whether they should be removed from San Francisco. And so they wanted the most detail they could possibly have on what was going on in Chinatown. So these different colors that are shown there, there's a code, a key next to the map that tells you what the different colors mean. So tan is for general Chinese occupancy, so that's most of what you can see in that detail of the map. Pink is for Chinese gambling houses. Green is for Chinese prostitution, so there's only one of those you can see in that particular bit of the map. A yellow, a brighter yellow than that tan we can see, is for Chinese opium resorts. Red is for Chinese joss houses or temples. Blue equals white prostitution. And if you look at the whole map, it's quite interesting that there's just about as much blue as there is green visible in the map. So there's probably almost equal amounts of white houses of prostitution and Chinese houses of prostitution that they're showing there. And then not listed in the key, but also shown on the map are when there's a white space without some other coloration put in, that is a white-owned business. So 924 DuPont Street, where Mrs. Li Hin and her husband lived, is right near the middle of the bottom part of the map. It's right next to a vertical white rectangle, which was a white-owned dry goods store. And so just to the left of that, I guess it would be your left anyway, is the address where they lived, which seems like they lived upstairs of a Chinese-owned jewelry store. Now, yes, we can go on to the next slide. So this is a photo of DuPont Street. We don't know the exact address of it, so don't know whether by any chance it shows the address where this couple lived or if it's anywhere particularly near their address. But I thought an interesting image to just kind of give us a glimpse of the area we're talking about. And we can go on to the next slide. So more of this article. The reason this article exists, the reason it came into being is because some policemen had seen this woman living in Chinatown and thought, she's a white woman, what's she doing married to a Chinese man? And the police and the reporters investigated. So a bit from this article, it says, she answered the reporter's knock in person and greeted him with, "What is it, sir?" And her tones were as devoid of accent as those of the veriest American that had never left his native heath. When her somewhat abashed visitor finally confessed that his call was purely one of curiosity, she did not seem overpleased, but was somewhat mollified when he added that he had been attracted by the reports of her beauty. She smiled in token of partial forgiveness of the intrusion, but almost immediately resumed her dignified air and replied, "Well, sir, that is neither my fault, nor can I say that it is my misfortune. It is certainly nobody's business. There have been handsome Chinese women before, and I cannot see why I should be an object of curiosity." And then we can go to the next slide with more of this lovely article. So the reporter has the gall to argue with this woman about what her ethnicity is, and he says, "But you certainly are not of Chinese parentage." And she replies, "I certainly am. True, I was born in this country and have lived in white communities all my life, but my parents were both Chinese. Do you remember them?" "Of course I do. My mother is still living in Humboldt County, and I had never been away from her up to the time when I was married." And then, perhaps not surprisingly, Mr. Li Hin himself objects to his wife talking with this reporter. And she says, "That is my husband, and he does not like me to talk to white people." And the reporter asks, "Why not?" And she says, "Oh, I don't know, but he don't." And the reporter asks, "What is his business?" And she says, "He is doing nothing at present, but I think he will soon buy an interest in a cigar store here. You will have to excuse me now. He wants me to come in." So we can go on to the next slide there. So trying to figure out who this woman might possibly have been. Of course, now the only name they give for her is Mrs. Li Hin. They don't say what her age is, so we don't have any further details to be able to really definitively say who this person was. Now, the fact that her mother is still living in Humboldt County in April of 1885 made me suspect that her mother probably was not living in Eureka, because if she had been, she probably would have been among those people expelled. So thinking she was probably living in some other community in Humboldt County. And that led me to a tentative identification that it's possible that Mrs. Li Hin might be a same person as a child who is shown in that excerpt from the 1870 U.S. Census that we've got up there. In 1870, there's a family shown in Arcata. The head of the household is Ah Hua. He's 51. He's shown as a washerman. And his personal estate is shown as being worth $100, which actually is pretty impressive because the majority of, in fact, the majority of everybody, but certainly the majority of the Chinese people shown in the census records in Humboldt County are not shown as having any personal estate valued at anything. So he seems to have been at least a fairly substantial citizen member of the community with that being shown. It shows his wife, Sun Quill, looks like it might be her name. She's age 45, and she's shown as keeping house. And it shows their daughter, Harriet, looks like age 6 is at least how I've interpreted that number. And she was born in California. And the reason I focused on this family as possibly being, who Mrs. Li Ah-hin is this idea of Harriet being, a English, Americanized, westernized name, seemed to fit with her being born in white communities and living in white communities all her life. And the age being, it seems like 6 in 1870, so she'd be 16 in 1880, she'd be about 20 or so in 1885, so would be a age that would work for her to be this Mrs. Li Ah-hin. So again, it's just a guess, but they seemed like possibly this might be identifiable with this lady. Another thing that was mentioned in the article was that she had marvelous command of the English language, and the reporter asked her about that, and it said to this she replied that it came natural to her and she could speak English or Chinese with equal facility. And the other thing that I've got shown on that slide there is a section, an excerpt from the 1876 San Francisco Business Directory, which shows among the Chinese cigar makers or cigar manufacturers a Hin Li at 316 Commercial Street in San Francisco. It also shows clairvoyance on there in case you wanted to know how many clairvoyants there were in San Francisco in 1876. So again, it's not certain, but it might be the same Mr. Li Hin or Hin Li, who she says that he's likely to be going in or buying a cigar business. And the mention of him doing nothing at present, again, it's only speculation. We don't know for sure whether he was among the people who were expelled from Eureka or whether she had come down to San Francisco to marry him and he had already been living there. But this idea of him doing nothing at present seems possibly because he was up here and had been expelled and so is looking for a way to rebuild his business after that. And we can leave these people now and go on to the next slide. And so the other person I decided to highlight is somebody who's known as Charlie Mock or Mook or Muck, and numerous different spellings appear for him in various census records and newspaper accounts. He is one of the people that we know of who had a Chinese-owned store, Chinese-owned business here in Eureka. And there's actually a surprisingly, at least seems surprising to me, large number of Chinese businesses that do advertise in the Eureka newspapers in the early 1880s. So Charlie Mock there has got his China grocery store and employment office, which is on E Street between 4th and 5th. And it mentions that he will furnish cooks, railroad laborers, and laborers of all kinds, and that he sells all kinds of rice, sugar, coffee, and other groceries. And which seemed pretty interesting to me because it seems pretty clear that he's not just aiming at Chinese customers, but also at the more general readership of the Humboldt Times telephone, which is what this is appearing in. And as I mentioned, there are several others who have ads in the newspapers of the time. Kang Hop advertised many, many times. He also sold tea, rice, sugar, and oils, Chinese provisions, Chinese and Japan lacquerware, fancy goods, and clothing. And a number of ads also make it clear that he sold fireworks, and he has a particularly large number of advertisements for his fireworks around the 4th of July. Others who advertised are Sing Chung Company and Sam Lee, both of which were laundries. Lee Sing, which was another store, and that ad had almost the same wording as the wording for Kang Hop, with the goods that he sold. The Wong Chung Hai Chinese Intelligence Office, labor contractor G. Todd, and also there was another store called the China Grocery Store, owned by a man named La Lung. So we can go on to the next slide. So again, trying to find out more about who this person was. In the 1880 census, there's a listing for a Charlie Mook, so not quite the same spelling, but seems close enough that it might very likely be the same person. He's shown as a laborer, age 23, born in Canton. And the listing right above him is Kang Hop, who we've mentioned a couple of times, one of the other people who had a Chinese grocery store and general merchandise store in town. And the other images on there are some details of the 1886 Sanborn map of Eureka showing the Chinatown area. Now, of course, 1886 is after the expulsion, and there's a number of things that you can see on that map which definitely show the effects of the expulsion having taken place. But from the ad mentioning that his China grocery store was on E Street between 4th and 5th, I was trying to figure out from that, where on this map it might appear. I think it's probably not the large building right on the corner of 4th and E shown there, because that is shown as being a laundry in 1886. So my guess is that it was probably a laundry already before the Chinese expulsion, as it seems like it would be most easy to turn a Chinese-owned laundry into a white-owned laundry rather than to completely repurpose the building. And it seemed like also probably the ad would have mentioned he was at the corner if he was at the corner. So I think it's probably one of the 4 other buildings shown, which are north of the alley that's now Charlie Moon Way. So in the area that's now the Coast Central Credit Union parking lot is my best guess as to where Charlie Mook's building was located. Now, he appears quite a bit in newspaper articles about the Chinese experience actually after the expulsion. A lot of the mentions of him happen in 1886. And there's a San Francisco Chronicle article in January of 1886, so almost a year after the expulsion. And a man named A.J. Bledsoe, who was actually one of the members of the Committee of 15, the business leaders of Eureka, who were sort of the spearheaders of the expulsion from Eureka. He was asked by a San Francisco Chronicle reporter about Charlie Mock. And A.J. Bledsoe said, "This Charlie Mock is one of the most notorious highbinders on the coast," so a gangster, a term used for Chinese gangsters at the time. And when he lived in Eureka, he was continually mixed up in a row of some kind. If a fusillade of shots was heard in Chinatown, people knew that Mock was amusing himself, and if a Chinaman now and then was buried unexpectedly, it was a general belief that Mock had had a hand in ending his mortal career. Interestingly, this doesn't seem to be borne out by newspaper coverage of the time, before the expulsion. There are mentions of gunplay in Chinatown in 1884 and early 1885, but nothing at that time seems to be saying, yeah, it's Charlie Mock amusing himself. So this seems to possibly be Bledsoe kind of after the fact, adding some of this onto Mock's reputation. And he also said, Bledsoe did, at the time of David Kendall's death last February, it was the opinion of many that Mock fired the fatal bullet. We had him before the committee together with other highbinders, but we could not identify him as the one who fired the shot. And I'm going to try to get to the next page. I think we can go to the next slide there. And the next page does not want to be turned. All right. Now, this mentioned that he was before the committee and they tried to figure out if he could be identified as the one who fired the shot. There was actually a trial that took place, a couple of trials of men who were accused of being the person who fired the fatal shot that set the expulsion in motion. Those men who were tried were named, or at least known as in the records, Ah Kao and Lim Gao. And there were 2 others, Sing Yek and Ah Chui, various different spellings of his name, who were going to be tried, but the cases against them were dismissed. Now, you can see that we've got this January 14th, 1886 newspaper article that we have excerpts from up there. And the reason Charlie Mock was in the newspapers a lot in early 1886 was because he apparently was sent up to Eureka as a representative of a number of the Chinese community members who had been expelled to make an attempt to buy property in or around Eureka in order to be able to come back to Eureka. And I think the idea was that if they actually owned the property, then it would be a lot more difficult to expel them again, whereas part of the problem with the expulsion here was that the Chinese people were renting their businesses, their buildings here, and so they didn't actually own any of the property. So there was this effort to actually reestablish a Chinese community in Eureka by coming up and buying property. And there's an article saying that about a week ago, so that would have been around January 7th of 1886, Charlie Mock made his appearance in Eureka, boldly parading the streets and conducting himself in a very independent manner. And in this attempt by some of the Chinese community members to buy land up here, they were apparently assisted by a white resident of Eureka named Robert Henry. Some of the newspaper articles claim that he was a willing accomplice of theirs. Eventually, he issued a denial in the Humboldt Standard, saying, "No, it's a misunderstanding. I loaned Charlie Mock a little bit of money because he needed some help, but I didn't try to buy land for the Chinese or anything like that." But of course, we can see from some of the newspaper articles why he might have made this denial, even if it was not in fact true. It seems that filing the suit of Wing Hing versus the city of Eureka, which is something you'll hear about a little later, that waited until the result was known of whether these community members, Chinese community members, would be able to buy property here. And they probably only brought suit against the city of Eureka because this attempt to buy property had failed. The Humboldt Standard of 13th of January, 1886, it said, "Marshal Lindsay was approached this morning about 8 o'clock by Charlie Mock and other Chinamen who asked him if he knew of any land near the city that could be bought." And he apparently said, "Well, yeah, there's land for sale, but you guys can't buy it." And the Humboldt Times of January 10th of 1886 said, "Any white man, if he is a man, had better be careful in regard to negotiations for property he knows Chinamen desire to occupy in the city of Eureka. One pretended specimen of white manhood is already spotted as a negotiator in that direction. He had better stop or jump into the bay to save himself from being drawn and quartered." So from that, you can see why Robert Henry might have felt it was a wise move to issue a denial in the newspaper that he'd been involved with this. He was around 37 at the time. He was a laborer born in New Brunswick, and in 1880, in the census records, he lived in a hotel on E Street, so possibly even the Bay Hotel that was right here at the location where we are now. And so he would have lived very close to the Chinatown area, and so one can see how he would have become acquainted with and possibly friends with some members of the Chinese community. Now, this article up there, basically some of the white business leaders of town accosted Charlie Mock and told him to get out of here. He apparently said, I don't have the money to pay for my passage on the steamship, which I imagine he probably had plenty of money. He just didn't want to let these guys kick him out without them at least having to pay for his passage. And so they did pay for his ticket on the steamship. And there's this description there in the article about how he did not turn to salute a score or more of his countrymen as he had done on former occasions. Now, that's just all it says. It doesn't give a full description of why they're saying this, but kind of the subtext that I read into that, it seems to me like this might be something that he was actually known for, that on previous occasions when he lived in Eureka and had been traveling back and forth between Eureka and San Francisco, I can imagine him there on the deck of the steamship doing this kind of jaunty wave to some of his compatriots on the dock, which seems to be the kind of thing that they're describing in that newspaper article. Now, the records are unclear as to whether or not Charlie Mock was also, after this attempt to buy property, whether he was also one of the people who brought the paperwork for the Wing Hing versus the city of Eureka suit up to Eureka. But I have seen at least one newspaper article that says that he was one of the people who did that. And we can go on to the next slide. And just kind of one kind of contrasting thing that I wanted to also highlight as giving us a sort of different glimpse of some of the experiences of Chinese community members in Eureka. It's this account of the Ghost Festival in August of 1884. Now, the Ghost Festival takes place in the 7th lunar month in the lunar calendar. The Ghost Day, I believe, is on the 15th of the 7th lunar month, and in 1884, at least if I read it correctly in the online source that I looked at for transferring lunar calendar and Gregorian calendar for translating between them, it looks like that 15th day of the month was on September 9th. On that particular year. Now, that's the date that this article was published, and it's talking about a celebration that took place here in Eureka on the 7th, so right around the Ghost Day date, and the 7th month is, basically the Ghost month, the Ghost Festival month. And part of this celebration, it's paying respect to the dead. Some of the traditional celebrations and commemorative activities that are done are burning paper spirit money and making other offerings to the spirits of the dead, and lanterns to guide the spirits home, guide them back to where these offerings are being made. And so there's this Humboldt Times telephone article from September 9th of 1884, which you can see some of up there. And it says, at 12 o'clock last Tuesday night, the Chinese quarters were ablaze with light. On each side of 4th Street from E to F, there was a line of fire, and at intervals here and there were groups of Chinamen engaged in throwing into the flames something which looked like brown paper. The 2 lines of fire were caused by innumerable wax candles stuck in the earth near the sidewalk, burning steadily with a clear white flame. At 2 points midway of the block, there were large bonfires industriously fed by the Chinese. Now, the reporter then goes on to completely misinterpret the festival and the meaning of the ceremony. He interpreted the ghost money as devil money instead, and he thought it was being offered to the devil rather than to the spirits of the dead. And he suggested that the paper consumed by the fire represented so much coin of the devil's realm withdrawn from general circulation. We can go on to the next slide. So here up above is a non-colorized version of a photo that you've seen elsewhere in the slide, showing both sides of 4th Street between E and F. So that's where this celebration is described in the article. And so you can imagine the candles all up along both sides of the street there and next to the sidewalk, and the bonfires burning at 2 places. And the image below is about as close as I could find to sort of showing some of the same kind of ceremony at close to around the same time in the United States. It's an 1877 illustration called Burning Joss Papers from Harper's Weekly magazine, and it's an article about the Chinese people of Virginia City, Nevada. And we can go on to the next one. And so to the left is that same image again, just a little bit larger, so you can get a bit more of a detailed look at it. And so again, these are some people burning the spirit money or the joss paper in front of their house in possibly somewhat similar circumstances to what was described in that article. And the image on the other side, the right-hand side of the screen there, that is a different festival being held by Chinese people in the United States. That's from Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper article from October of 1884, showing the Mid-Autumn Festival and showing mooncakes up in the top left of the image and moon watching as part of the traditions of that festival. And I've read that this is thought to perhaps be the first depiction of mooncakes in an English language American publication. And so although this is a different festival, I wanted to include it because it's from the same year as this description of the Ghost Festival in Eureka. And something that it reminded me of was a very striking statement in an article I'd read recently, the article being The Social Origins of Early Chinese Immigrants, a Revisionist Perspective by Haiming Liu from 2002. And a statement in that article is, immigrants are people who travel overseas with their culture intact. And we often don't really see the immigrants in this kind of experience just from the depictions that we get from outsiders, from people not within that particular community. We don't see the continuation of their culture and their traditions and all of this being part of their lives as much here as it was in their homelands. But this, I think, gives a rare glimpse of that. We don't know of any temple or shrine specifically that was here in Eureka, like the Joss House in Weaverville or the Bok Kai Temple in Maryville. It's probable, I think, that there were shrines in individual homes and stores. So the description of the Ghost Festival and then some glimpses of ceremonies like we see there do give us a rare chance to see the Chinese community of Eureka continuing their religious and cultural traditions here in their new home. And so I will hand it back over to Katie at this point.
All right. Thank you, Alex. So now we'll get into the Chinese expulsion of 1885. We kind of danced around it a little bit, so now we'll get into the story itself. Here's a map, which, I forgot to update this. Anyway, here's the map. This is the 1886 Sanborn map, which we had taken a look at earlier. This is just kind of zoomed out with a couple of key elements highlighted. So the months leading up to February 1885, we see a number of news stories appearing in local newspapers talking about some kind of increase in gun violence and general violence around Chinatown. Some reports claim that there's a new group of these highbinder gangster types that have come into town that are trying to cheat Chinese residents out of money, collect on debts, things like that. But because of just the number of different stories that kind of try to explain why the expulsion happened, we're not exactly sure if that's what happened. But there was this noted increase in violence in the papers. So it's the probably rainy, cold evening of February 6th, 1885. David Kendall, who's the guy shown in the picture here, this very happy young man, he was walking down East Street, either going to or from his house, which is shown in the corner. I think we actually need to update that location, but it's in that general vicinity. And he's walking down the street, and there's shots that ring out from Chinatown. Kendall, who afterwards there's this huge eulogy that gets put into the newspapers talking about how great of a man he was and all this stuff. So he was eulogized as this great businessman, council member, really important guy. He ends up getting hit by one of the stray bullets, and he falls on the ground. Someone ends up carrying him back to his house, and he dies there shortly thereafter. And people start to say the shots came from Chinatown. Oh no, what are we going to do now? So one story also actually claims that the shots came from Sing Yek's store, which I'd kind of pointed out in a much earlier slide. So what happens is the police go in there, round up everyone who's in there, they take them to the jail. There's eventually hearings and things to try to figure out which one of them shot Kendall. It ends up being inconclusive, and those men are later released. But besides that, a dramatic event happens, and what happens? A mob forms. So there's a mob that forms at Centennial Hall, just outside of Chinatown. That's the parking lot behind the Arkley now. It's just a parking lot now. But everyone assembles there. There's a couple hundred people who show up within, minutes. This is kind of the rainy season. There's an economic recession going on. There's a lot of bars nearby, so people might have just been hanging around and kind of say, hey, what's going on over there, So people kind of run over. And there's this agitation that kind of starts happening. The sheriff and the mayor get on board. They stand up at the front of the meeting and say, we're not going to break any laws here. Keep it chill, guys. We need to not do anything sketchy. And we're not going to do anything violent. We'll see how that worked out. People begin demanding some kind of solution. They're saying there's been this long-standing Chinese problem. I had talked about earlier how there was kind of that weird spot on the sidewalk. There was a lot of water that ended up in Chinatown. There's kind of this blue line here. There's a little slough that kind of goes through the area. When the roads were raised, it trapped a lot of that water in there. And this is a time when indoor plumbing wasn't necessarily big everywhere, especially in rural outposts like Eureka. So people are complaining that Chinatown is a health hazard. This is something that is going to cause issues. There's also these accusations of morality and Chinese people being immoral and all this kind of stuff. Gambling, prostitution, drugs, gunfights, things like that. So people say, what are we going to do about this? There's a couple of different options that are thrown out there first. One of them is to burn down Chinatown with everyone in it. You notice on this map here, there's a lot of buildings in yellow. On this particular Sanborn map, those buildings in yellow are all wooden. So you could imagine if the fire got out of Chinatown, it could burn down probably half the town. So there were the people who owned that particular property where Chinatown was. Their representatives were there. They said, no, let's not do that because I own a bunch of property around it and I don't want my other stuff to burn down. So they say no. Then people say, well, we can run everyone into the forest. And they're like, well, we're not doing that either. So what ends up happening is a committee of 15 is assembled. They sit down and try to figure out what they're going to do, and they decide, we'll just ship everyone out. Whoops, here we go. So I'd mentioned that the sheriff and the mayor said we're not going to be doing anything violent or illegal here. Here's two reports of that particular day. So the one that's an actual reproduction of the newspaper, that's from 1910, so that's a retrospective looking back at what had happened. So despite the claim to let's not get violent, there's things like this showing up in the newspaper where, we're going to torch the Chinese community. And the only reason why we didn't was because there were influential leaders that said let's not. But then there's also this other article that I kind of quoted here from the Daily Alta California for February 10th, 1885, so shortly after the expulsion, that, people conducted operations quietly, but it wouldn't have taken much to start a massacre in Eureka at the time if the Chinese had offered any resistance. So we had mentioned the Committee of 15 earlier. Here's their names and kind of what we've been able to piece together, what some of them do. There was one article that I located a while ago, and I need to re-find it, that lists everyone and says you should patronize their businesses. They're helping to protect Eureka and remove the Chinese community. So you might recognize some of these names, especially if you've been around in local history for a while. So it's something important to keep in mind when we're interpreting local history. Not everyone's all good, not everyone's all bad. There are different sides to everyone, but this is something that people should be aware of. So there's a lot going on here, but we will go to the next one. So one of the common stereotypes that we hear about Chinese people at this time is that they come here, they work, then they leave, they send all their money to China, they don't contribute to our economy, things like that. There's a number, this is an article here that details some of these residents that at least whoever this reporter was able to talk to. These residents had lived 10 to 14 years in Eureka. There were other people that might have lived longer in Eureka. But that's pretty significant because the town at this particular time is only about 35 years old. So people had been there almost since the beginning. And it makes me wonder, what could this Chinese community have looked like had the expulsion not happened? And that's just kind of something that stuck with me. So the Chinese residents pack up all their things as much as they can carry, or carry in carts or things like that, and they're taken out to the docks, the waterfront. We don't exactly know where. This is kind of what we've been able to piece together on another Sanborn map. And these are, the warehouses where people went to. So they were taken there. They ended up having to stay a little longer than the 24 hours that the Committee of 15 gave them due to tides in the ships and things like that. And there's at least one article that talks about one of the lawyers who later went on to represent the city of Eureka and Wing Hing, talking about being at the warehouses and seeing people with all of their stuff. Also, since we're here, this is the foot of F Street, and there's at least one map I've been able to find that also locates some Chinese laundries around here. So the foot of F Street is Coast Guard Plaza, I remember right. So that's kind of interesting. And John Vance, who was later the mayor of Eureka, he was also big in the lumber industry, he owned that particular property. And there's this short little 2-line newspaper clipping that says, like, the Chinese laundries owned by John Vance or on his property were torn down today. Let's all celebrate, something like that. I think this is Alex.
So I'll jump back in for a moment. These are just 2 ads for the ships, the Humboldt and the City of Chester, which were the steamships that made regular trips between Eureka and San Francisco. And one of them would leave Eureka every Wednesday, and the other would leave every Saturday. So the situation at the time when the expulsion happened, the weather had been terrible, and the Wednesday ship was basically stuck here because it couldn't get out past Humboldt Bar. It actually tried to sail every day of that week, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, etc., and kept having to turn back and come back to the docks. Now, apparently, the Saturday ship was able to get in. It was easier to get into the bay than to get out of the bay. But so that means that when the killing of Kendall happened on the Friday and all these people were forced out of their homes and businesses and forced down to these warehouses, there was the Wednesday ship, which was still waiting in harbor, and there was also the Saturday ship waiting to go as well. So the ultimatum that had been given by the Committee of 15 to the Chinese community members was that they had to leave on Saturday. Saturday, they're all down at the warehouse with all the things that they were able to get down there and ready to go, but the ships, plural, still can't get out because of the weather. So you can imagine how incredibly horrifying this must have been for these people, knowing that the vigilantes have told them, if you're not out by Saturday, you'll be killed. And here they are waiting to leave, but they can't leave because of the conditions of the weather. So it just must have been agonizing. I guess we can go to the next slide. Is that?
I'm just going to scroll back real quick. I had forgotten to mention. So one of the things that's labeled on here on the corner of 4th and F Street is gallows. There was a gallows that was set up during the expulsion at some point. We don't know who set it up. We don't know where the gallows came from. But it was set up with a sign that said any Chinaman here after Saturday, would be hung from these gallows. As far as we know, no one was hung from the gallows. There was a close call. Reverend Huntington, who was a person who stood up during the Centennial Hall meeting and said maybe we shouldn't remove everyone for one man's poor actions or, the shooting. One of his students had come by his house during the expulsion and said, "Hey, I just wanted to say, bye to you. You'd, been my teacher at the church, at the Congregationalist church. I wanted to say goodbye." And there happened to be a mob that cruised by and came in and tried to forcefully remove that young Chinese man and drag him down the street to the gallows. Huntington chased him down and said, "No, don't hang this guy from the gallows." And they were able to somehow chill the situation enough that the young man was able to not be hung. But that's one of the events that could have gone very poorly, even more so than it already did. Okay, let's see. There we go.
So now this slide that I put in is to give a glimpse of the same exact location while the Chinese community was still here and then at some time shortly after the expulsion. So Katie mentioned earlier that at the northeast corner of 4th and E Streets, there was a laundry, Tung Sing Laundry, it says on the sign that you can see in the black and white photo, I think washing and ironing Tung Sing. And we don't know the identity of the man shown in front of the building, but that I think it's really wonderful to have because it's one of the very few verifiable images of a Chinese community member of Eureka at the time that the community was still here. And the sort of colorized image at the bottom is the same exact view, but sometime probably in 1886 after the expulsion, when that building, which was Tung Sing's laundry, has become the Eureka Fish Market. And one of the things that you can see comparing the two photos is that some of the buildings have been torn down. There's, I think, 4 buildings that you can see beyond the tall 2-story building for these kind of 1-story buildings with the gables facing towards the street. You can see them in the earlier image. But then in the later image, I think there's only maybe 1 or 2. I can't really see it well from this angle too. All right, so at least 2 buildings have been torn down there, and there seems to be a fence in front of where those buildings were. And one of those buildings, which was torn down, was Sing Yek's store, where supposedly the people who were involved in the shooting actually were at the time the shooting took place. And in a detail from the Sanborn map, you can see that kind of blank space between Rix's livery stable and the buildings that are still there, so showing the place where those buildings were torn down. And we can go to the next one. And that's just a closer up view of these two images, just to try and get a closer view of this man who is one of those community members who very likely was among those expelled. And yes, I think that's all I wanted to talk about on there, so I'll hand it back over to Katie.
All right, so generally when you hear stories about the Chinese expulsion, there's a shooting, the Chinese residents get expelled, and then there were no Chinese people until Benchin, but there's a couple of caveats to that story. One of them is the Winghing court case. So upon arriving in San Francisco, there were about 54 Chinese residents, including 2 women, that filed the Winghing versus the City of Eureka court case, and that was with help from the Chinese 6 companies, which was a mutual aid society that supported Chinese immigrants to the United States. The full document, which you can actually look at virtually, is at the Cal Poly Humboldt Special Collections. It outlines the names of each plaintiff, the amount that they lost, and some other kind of important information. It serves as a valuable resource that we can pair with things like the census records to find out more information about Chinese residents. The residents were suing for property that was damaged, destroyed, or in general lost during the expulsion. So since the event happened so fast, people didn't have time to sell off their businesses, sell off whatever stock they had. They didn't have a chance to return, the laundry that they had been working on for people and be paid for that. And they could take only what they carried. So that was a significant loss in potential intergenerational wealth for these people. And also, there's also the emotional trauma that this situation caused for so many people who were impacted. So in the Winghing case, there were 2 lawyers that were hired by the 6 companies. They were named Hall McAllister and Thomas Riordan. Both of them were really well-known lawyers for their time, and they regularly represented Chinese clients through the 6 companies who hired them. Let's see, that's kind of extra. So they were very well known, and this was what they did pretty regularly at the time. There were a lot of cases being filed against individuals, against various entities by Chinese residents. In the end, however, the case did not rule in favor of the Chinese, and they did not receive these reparations that they were trying to get. And what ended up happening was other cities were looking to what the outcome of this court case was going to be. And after this, we start seeing many more expulsion type events happening. People were touting this as the Eureka Plan. There's other regions where we see things coming down to being as similar as, we also have a committee of, sometimes it was 15, sometimes it was 5 or 3 or any number of people. And so we start seeing more of this happening in other places as well. And the newspaper articles that came out after this particular case were published all over the place, and word spread really fast about what had happened. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Yolanda. I believe you're the next person to be talking. I think Rob's going to introduce.
Thank you to our historians. I've been studying this topic for years, and I still learn something new every time I talk to Katie and Alex. So this has been great. But now we're going to move up sort of into the contemporary period and look at the legacies of these events. And Yolanda and Daryl will be speaking to that. And just to introduce our next speaker, Yolanda Latham is a great-great-granddaughter of Charlie Moon and Minnie Tom. And you may know the name Charlie Moon. Charlie Moon Way has been renamed in his honor over where Eureka Chinatown used to be. Many people considered him the only Chinaman allowed to remain in Humboldt County, which isn't true. There were other people, but he's the most famous. She is an enrolled member of the Hoopa Valley tribe and a direct descendant of the Cholula and Wilkut tribes. She has spent her career working in Indian country, focusing on community health. In 2020, she read an article on racism and violence against Asian Americans during the COVID-19 epidemic, and in her own words, quote, she knew she had to advocate, partner, and be an indigenous ally to all Asian Americans, so she volunteered for the Eureka Chinatown Project. So I'm very happy to have Yolanda joining us.
Thank you. First, before I speak, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded land of the Wiyot people, and I'd like to send them some peace and love during this time. As much as we like to think things are perfect, we always like to stay on the positive side. But to acknowledge the sacrifices and the loss there and send them respect. First of all, thank you guys for having me here to the Eureka Chinatown Project and the panel. I'm not really one to be front and center. I think the idea, or what I've been taught growing up, is it's always good to raise other people up to help them say what they need to be, help them say what needs to be said. But sometimes I think it's okay to stand up and say, hey, I'm Yolanda, and I have ideas and I have opinions. The Moon family is still here. We're among all the tribes in the area in California, specifically Humboldt, Del Norte, Trinity, Siskiyou, and some in other countries. We're a huge family. We are enrolled members in a lot of the tribes. I can count 7, but I'm sure there's many more out there. We're still alive in the sense of we still practice our traditions, and we maintain the religious and spiritual aspects of that. And part of that is to be good, to think positive, and to wish good among other people. So when I read the article about Chinese people or Asian Americans getting attacked for COVID-19, it seemed absolutely absurd to me. And I could hear my mother's voice saying, never forget where you came from, and that was something we always had to hold on to, because being part Chinese in Indian community is not always the easiest. Everybody knows where they come from. They know where the bloodline goes, because the government was very stern and told us you're either a half, full, 3/4, and they counted every little bit of it for us. And, our great aunties and uncles were forced into schools where they weren't allowed to speak their language. And so we could relate to I felt like I could relate to what Asian Americans were experiencing, and that is prejudice, discrimination, racism based on a stereotype and perception that is just untrue. I think there's something I saw in the presentation just now. It just kind of reminded me of something recently. And it was, they thought the solution was, we're going to put these folks on a boat, ship them out. That's the answer, or burn them down, burn them out of the area. It's not like we've never heard of those things before. And I recently read an article, and I think I saw somebody on the news in another part of America saying our unhoused population, we're just going to give them a ticket to LA, or we're going to give them a ticket to Florida, wherever, Has that concept changed? Have we changed as a civilization and human people? We can, show people the results of what had happened in the past, but I find that we struggle as a human race and a nation of learning from those mistakes, if they even perceive them as mistakes. I think, there's a lot of stubborn people in the world, and those are the folks that I don't know that we can change their way of thinking, but agreeing to disagree and respecting differences is the way forward in my mind. You don't have to drink the same juice, but you can respectfully drink your juice, and I can drink my juice, and respect that boundary, and that's okay. But a lot of people don't want to do that. So I think of myself as kind of somebody who comes to the table with the good, positive vibes. I love the Eureka Chinatown Project. I love Hoppy. I love everything that it represents. It's good in the world. It is something that I hope a lot of people start getting on this idea and try to make it better and send the message, come together and show respect. Be respectful. That's really the key. And I can tell you a little bit about Redwood Creek. You guys are familiar with the Redwood Creek watershed. My family, we're pretty popular in the Humboldt County area for good and bad. I think we've made the Lost Coast Outpost probably for robbery, outrunning the police, just about everything you can think of. And I always send prayers to those cousins because something happened to trigger them. But, you know, I acknowledge it and I own it, and I'm not embarrassed of it, and I'm not embarrassed of any of my cousins that struggle, because we've been through a lot. Our generations have been through a lot, just as many of yours have been through a lot. And I think it's easier to step away and say, I'm too embarrassed to associate with those folks in Indian country, in non-Indian country, and in a community. It's the same. Not me. I'm out there saying, hi, cousin. I hope things are well. But I don't know what I can do for the Eureka Chinatown Project that many of you have done for yourself in your communities, and everybody on this panel has done in their own way and in their own respective positions and place in life. I think we're all aiming for the same thing, and that is for peace, prosperity, and a good community, but never to forget the past and never repeat it. How do we teach the next generation to do better? And that's really the key. Charlie Moon married Minnie Tom. I'm going to change the subject a little bit. Charlie Moon married Minnie Tom, but married is one version. We often ask, how did Minnie Tom end up with the lone Chinese person in Humboldt County? And in those days, I don't think marriage was an option for Native American women. We you know, my great-great-grandmothers, I don't believe, had a lot of options. You know, the gold rush came through, and just as many immigrants came to America, there wasn't many choices for them either. You know, you can see in the presentation that just having a laundry business was tough. You know, you really had to work, and then I'm pretty sure they probably got haggled down to pennies to do the work that nobody else wanted to do or needed to do. So I think there's a story there, and I think I've been working with my family to try to generate that narrative, and it takes time. And I know in the society we live now, we want the story now, we want the narrative now, we want to know what comes next. I've learned as I got older it doesn't happen like that. But it is a good story, and it is a lot of struggle. And I believe out of struggle come interesting people, and we benefit from that. So we're still here. We still, whether positive or negative, are in the community, and I always ask the community to send prayers. And it's easy to be negative, but to send positive energy to anyone struggling, especially a Moon, because we've had the Native American removal, genocide, you know, enslavement of children. You could take somebody's child and just take them and enslave them in your house just because you wanted to in the old days. And the state of California paid you to go get Native children and enslave them. And I don't know that we're having those conversations yet. So my family had to go through that and all the little things in that, boarding schools. All my great-great-aunties all went to boarding school. And you know what happened there. Some came out, some didn't. All my great-grandfathers all went to war, World War I, II, Vietnam War, and the wars way before that, including the Bald Hill Wars. All of those things are impactful. Then you come to today, you know, fast forward, somebody robs a bank, somebody outruns the police, and you think, what happened? Well, there's a lot of story there. I think there's excuses for things, you know, there's right and wrong, but there's a lot of history, but there's also a lot of good. Just as trauma comes onto your DNA, but so does the good. How do you learn how to forage for food? How do you learn how to fish? How do you learn how to raise your children and breastfeed? If you don't have a mother, you just learn, you know. These things, there's positive things that come out of this. And that's what I would like to share today, is that out of struggle, good things come. And with community, we can make better, hopefully better choices, agree to disagree, and respect each other's cultures, religions, and opinions, although that's not the exciting part. But we're still here, and we got a young lady named Chisa Hughes This young lady is just incredible. She's an artist, and she created this short documentary called Many Moons. And I don't know if we're going to watch it today, but it captures some really interesting things. And I'm going to let my friend over here talk a little bit about it and share his story. But I'm here to answer any questions you have. I am looking for allies for the Redwood Creek Water Basin to try to help restore the fish, restore the land, all that good stuff, but in partnership, in community, not to remove other people. Just because it was done to you in the past doesn't mean you do it to others. So, but other than that, that's all I have to say. I don't have much more. I'm not sugarcoating anything. I could talk about the negative, but I believe those stories are earned. There's something that we say in Indian country, is that there's a story that everybody has, a personal story of all the little details, but it has to be earned. And you can't share it with just anybody. So as much as I want to share the details here today, it has to be earned, and it's private, but it's also special and it's sacred. You know, we survived for a reason. We knew how to survive, and we got where we are today. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. To introduce our last speaker, Daryl Nghi Chin was born in Utah, and his first language was Toisanhua, which was the dialect of Cantonese most likely spoken by the people who lived in, Chinese people who lived in Humboldt County before the 1885 expulsion. Daryl grew up in the San Francisco East Bay and attended after-school Chinese school for 6 years, and he went to UC Santa Barbara and Johns Hopkins University. He has been publishing his poetry and other projects since 1973. He is a founding member of the North Redwoods Book Arts Guild and served as Humboldt County Coordinator for California Poets in the Schools, among other accomplishments that I don't have time to list today. He has taught poetry writing to school children in 7 states and is currently working with other community members to create the Eureka Chinatown Monument. He is also highly skilled at preparing Chinese cuisine, and I have enjoyed that myself. So I'll hand it over to Daryl now.
I guess I don't need to say anything more. So I had some prepared remarks, but I'm going to speak off those notes. You know, the mob, when somebody mentioned the mob after the shooting, we do that today. You've heard of flash mobs? You've heard of Twitter knobs? You've heard of demonstrations whose impetus was somebody saying, I'm being arrested illegally, and somebody, suddenly there are 500 police or 500 onlookers. My mother was the oldest of 12. My grandparents were all from China. My grandfather and my father ran a laundry, not together. If you go to Park City, Utah, how many of you been to Park City, Utah? Okay. How many of you have ever noticed a street called China Bridge? Okay. If you go down the street from the main street, if you go down China Bridge, at the end there's a parking lot. And there used to be a bridge across a gully. And at this end of the China Bridge was my grandfather's laundry. So that's, and my grandfather, my grandmother's husband, got to bring her here courtesy of the United States Postal Service, because there are exceptions to the immigration law that said you could come to the United States if you were a scholar, if you were in the diplomatic corps, if you were the family of a business person, okay? And so my grandfather was working for the Postmaster General under Woodrow Wilson, and this man, Burleson, said, "What can we do for you?" And he said, "There's somebody I'm engaged to," so she was brought to the United States as a servant in the diplomatic corps. So she got to the docks in San Francisco, probably wearing something that said, "If lost, take to the nearest post office." Okay. So that's the history, and that's why Burleson was from Texas. So my parents went back to Texas with him, and that's why my mother was born in Austin, Texas. Okay, and my father was born in southern China, where most of the Chinese came from, before 1965. Okay. My father wanted to be a scholar. He was able to memorize Confucius when he was a kid, which is a high accomplishment for any Chinese person. If you pass a civil service exam in China before the last emperor, you were given a civil service job for life. So that's how prestigious learning was in China. And my parents raised me with that ideal. They said Chinese always go for education. That's a stereotype because in some ways, there are a lot of Chinese people who came here under much more modest circumstances. And as a matter of fact, my father was never able to go to college, even though he put 5 members of his family, including his wife, through college and university, running a laundry. So, you talk about essential workers. Well, who's the essential worker here? All right. Mooncakes. There was a mention of mooncakes here. I will mention to you that mooncakes play prominently in the overthrow of the Mongol dynasty. And during the uprising against the Mongol dynasty, the citizens had meetings, but they only communicated their meetings by hiding messages in mooncakes, because the authorities didn't think, oh, they're just celebrating mooncake season, but they didn't realize that little, messages, probably like fortunes you find in fortune cookies, were being passed, like we're going to do this, we're going to meet here, we're going to do that, this or that. So that's history of mooncakes. Somebody mentioned shrines, that we don't know whether there was a shrine or a temple in the Eureka Chinatown, but if you go to the Lao Market in Henderson Center, you will see, if you look around, you will see a little shrine. I don't know about the Japanese store on the next street over, okay? But I do know that if you go to some restaurants, like if you go to Curry Leaf, you'll see some things that look like a shrine, or, candles or something, or offerings, okay? The Chinese were not burning money. They were burning money because they burned money to believe that that's for the people who are dead, so they'll have money in heaven, okay? And the same thing for food, that's for their journey to the underworld or in the underworld. And people made fun of that. And my father told me a joke once. He said, somebody said to the Chinese person, well, they're not going to eat that food. And my father said, are they going to smell the flowers? So, turnabout. We should really thank some people who are not here today. Chisa, whose video you'll see in a little while. And Chisa made an artistic interpretation of her search for Charlie Moon. So you're going to see some controversy here. And the more I explore Chinese history in the United States and China, the more I learn. And therefore, the more I find out what I don't know. Okay? It took me a long time to finally say to the National Archives in San Bruno, could you help me find my father's immigration papers? But that was a long, tortured thing that took me years to finally accumulate enough details where I said, I think this is what you're looking for. And they wrote back in a week and said, yes, we have it. But by that time, I was 65, 70 years old. Okay? So when you look for your family ancestry, it takes persistence, and it's not necessarily easy or in a straight line. Here's some things that you should know that you may not know, okay? Anna May Wong, the actress, okay, was required, like my father was, to carry identity papers, unlike anybody else in the United States. Okay, you know, in Europe, that's kind of it's ordinary to carry identity papers. In the United States, it's not ordinary to carry identity papers. You can walk into a store and say, you know, I want to buy this, and nobody's going to ask you for identity papers. You can jump on a bus, okay? But the identity papers served for something like this. If you got on a bus during the Second World War, if you were Japanese, you were not allowed on the bus. So people loaned their Japanese friends their Chinese identity papers, okay? The Chinese, in the case of Wong Kim Ark, are responsible for what's called birthright citizenship. If you're born on U.S. soil, you are automatically an American citizen. And that's because a Chinese man, Wong Kim Ark, brought that to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court that wrote the Plessy versus Ferguson verdict was the same one that granted birthright citizenship. And if you don't know what Plessy versus Ferguson is, which I didn't know for a long time, it's the one that codified Jim Crow laws. Okay, so think about the contradictions there. Okay, I didn't know that there was a Chinese woman who was instrumental in the creation of the atom bomb. Okay, she was an experimental as well as a theoretical physicist, known for her rigor and her thoroughness in trying out things that she believed in. There are a lot of things that we don't know. I grew up in Richmond, California. We had greenhouses at the end of our street, and we never said, what are those greenhouses? Why are they empty? And only later did we learn about the displacement of the Japanese during the Second World War, and all their property being taken away from them. Some of which came back to them, a lot of which did not. Okay, so what I'm learning over the years with this Charlie Moon Project is I'm looking all over the globe. Okay, I'm looking at the expulsion of the Chinese sailors after the Second World War from Liverpool. Okay, they formed a major portion of the British Merchant Marine Fleet crews. And after the Second World War, somebody decided they were no longer necessary, so they disappeared. They literally disappeared. Okay, there were kids and wives and partners who didn't know where their dads were, and they never found out. Okay, so you can think about the Wing Hing case, where you have names, but we don't know really what happened to them. Okay, Alex was asking me, she said, do you have any idea of what happened to the Chinese after they left Eureka and landed in San Francisco? No, there's no record of that. There's a little bit, there's inference, which is what Alex has persistently searched for, and I'm really pleased she's got that much detail. Okay. So I would encourage you to keep an open mind. I want to tell you that I'm not related to Ben Chin, okay? All right? And I'm not Danny Ihara, the late Danny Ihara. And I'm not Xiaowei Wu, who played bass, who lives in Oregon now. I'm not Mark Shikuma, okay? There are other Daryl Chins in the United States and in the world, and I know about some of them. One of them I've met, and I ran into his sister on a telephone once who thought that I was her brother, okay? And she and I had she was very enthusiastic, and finally I said, who do you think I am? And she said, aren't you my brother? Okay, so anyway, stuff happens. What you're going to see is my messy room. You're going to see how Chisa and I working together. Chisa did all the work. She just asked me to be part of this. It's my T-shirts that are hanging on the clothesline, you'll see. But how her search shows you that a story is not a straight line. A story is something you always learn more about, okay? and I really want to thank her. I want to thank Brianne Merja, who's not here, but who pushed for, along with Katie, for this Chinatown project to go forward. And I remember Brianne put out an email saying, "What's happened with the Chinese?" And I said, I'm really glad to meet with you. And she said, "Well, I can do a Zoom." And I said, "No, we're going to meet in person." So that's what started it. So thank you very much. We're going to be open to questions. We'll be staying around here afterwards. So feel free to ask questions. Is the video ready to play? Yes.
Before we go, I just want to say that I'm not Mary Youngblood, the Grammy Award-winning flutist either. I've been mistaken for that person as well. Just thought I'd add that.
Right.
Actually, I had a friend when I lived in Beijing who played bass guitar, named surname Chin. We just called him Lao Chin.
I remember you growing up.
You remember me?
I do, yeah.
Because
Because you were Asian.
So what was your experience growing up around here? What kind of things do you feel like are important to what it was like for you?
I mean, I had no idea about the expulsion growing up.
You had no idea about what?
I didn't know about the expulsion growing up.
Are you sure you're not hungry or anything? I would see you walk to school.
Really?
Yeah. On Old Arcata Road and then Bayside Road, right? Yep, I would see you. There are kids I see, they grow up here and I just watch them from a distance. I feel like I'm connected to them. I look after them. I decided to move to Humboldt because I had a 1.5-year-old and I was pregnant. My husband's family lives up here. I didn't understand how a place could exist in California and be 30 years behind the rest of California. I'd say it took me about 20 years to call this place home, which was a long time.
Oh, I love that picture. You have such attitude in all of your pictures.
Attitude.
It's always arms crossed.
Only after we moved here did I find out about the Chinese expulsion. Only after we moved here did somebody come to my house. Did you grow up here? And I said, no. I said, why? He said, because I can remember a sign at Bucksport saying no Chinese or dogs allowed in the 50s. No Chinese or dogs allowed.
Well, when I grew up, we heard of what they did to the Chinese, and a lot of people used to poke fun at us and we'll run you out of town, you know, if you don't behave, you know. If you were Chinese, you wouldn't be talking Chinese. Yeah, hey, they left this one behind, you know. My mom went to school and they beat her because she talked Indian. So when I grew up, I'd ask her a question, she would say, I don't know. Hukdon means I don't know. Well, you want to see a photo? George, grab those 2 pictures on that, please. That's my mom and dad.
Wow.
And that's Charlie Moon.
Wow, that's an amazing picture.
Yeah.
Your father does look like he's...
He looks like George. And then my mother looks like my youngest daughter, so. And Charlie Moon, I don't know who he looks like. Charlie Moon, I guess.
considering we don't know anything about Grandpa's past.
Yeah.
We just know he was brought here.
Yeah, the last one was 20. Yeah, we're all trying to find like pieces of the past. We have newspaper accounts, but you know, like that.
Other families have different upbringing, but we were told what we were, and we were supposed to not forget where we come from.
We were also raised not to say we were Chinese, because we were protecting ourselves.
Especially our parents were.
It was bad enough being Indian, but to be Chinese on top of it was, they had a real hard time. And then your last name was Moon, you know, so.
No. 650 Yamaha V-Star. It's not a Harley. Everybody thinks it is though. Wage in Europe is a white man.
Are you part Yurok?
Yeah. My mom was full-blooded and my dad was full-blooded Hoopa. Or three quarters. Yurok and three-quarters Hoopa. So I'm a Hoop Rock. Actually, well, this is my grandfather, my dad's dad, and only one left out of this whole cruise, Oakland. Over the years, people come up and ask us about the story about him, you know. And I guess that ain't really his picture. That's not him. That's just a Chinese man. Who, my grandma Myrtle told us that. She said, no, that ain't the picture of him. But they used it and they see it in the newspaper. It was just, you know, I don't know who that man is.
I don't know how I'm ever going to find this out, but I would really like to know, just for my own sake, what other Chinese there were that nobody's talking about. If Charlie Moon was on the Hoopa Reservation, was there anybody else?
It just says Charlie Moon, Maple Creek Ranch, 1919. And then there's another one of him.
Chisa was talking to people up there, and some people said, oh, that's not Charlie Moon, even though it's attributed to being Charlie Moon.
This is another one that we have assumed anyway to be Charlie.
I guess that's one thing I wonder is if people who were trying to sort of stay behind. Yeah. I almost wonder, like, would you use the name Charlie Moon?
You might. You might.
Well, that's a very sophisticated
alias. Yeah.
Are these the names of people?
Ames, Jackson Ames.
It says Chinese.
Yes.
It says
William
Chinese.
Bow is.
There is William Bow. This is going to surprise a lot of old timers around Humboldt County as much as it did me. When I went out to teach on the Klamath River from 1904 to 1907, I found 3 elderly Chinese heads of families with Indian wives. Bao lived near Martin's Ferry. Then farther down the river near Capel lived Fong and John Cook.
Wow.
Well, it ends. I believed in Santa Claus once too.
You know, I feel like everything else that we've read has been like, there were others.
Right. And now this is naming names.
Yeah.
Well, I guess this is the man with no name. Can I pick him? I can see myself being kind of desperate in the situation, so.
You know, the assimilation of Native Americans and the expulsion of Chinese people are very similar. They stripped us from our culture. It's just been a battle to get it back.
Someone said Jackson Ames.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Have you heard of Jackson Ames?
Yeah, so my husband is raised by Ames.
Really?
Yeah.
But he was part Chinese.
Really?
Yeah. I've heard about Billy Bao, who was Chinese in Europe.
Uh-huh.
And his
He's just not as famous as Charlie, huh? I think the story of the Bear Ranch was more important than really the Charlie story, so I think that's why it was more famous. These heroic people saved Charlie, right? And if it wasn't for them saving Charlie, he wouldn't have been the last Chinese guy in Humboldt County. You know how history's written, right? There's not a lot of, we came here, we slaughtered, and we gave disease, and we took every identity away from the people that lived here, and now we give them government subsidies.
My gosh, I didn't even know this. Where is that bit? Oh my god. Yeah, China Mary. Oh my gosh. Right here. China Mary, a woman with no legal first or last name, resided in the county hospital marked with syphilis in the census. 2 Chinese women from Eureka were listed as daughters.
No legal first or last name.
Yeah.
Lived in the hospital with syphilis.
Whoa. My gosh. I think that's it.
that was really great. Thank you, Jay, and thanks for putting all this together. We obviously could not do it without the tech guy. So thank you for all your work. I had not seen this before. Chisa and I got to work together a little bit a couple years ago. There was a fellow from the New Yorker magazine who was writing about Chinese American history, and he got in touch with us about getting some material from Humboldt. So we got to collaborate. Really wonderful artist. I'm so impressed with that film. I don't know. I wonder people who aren't as informed about this story as we are, what they make of it and what they take away from that, because obviously we're very steeped in the subject. But I'm sure some of you may have questions for our panelists. I don't think that we really need to do this in any kind of formal fashion, but I'm happy to keep order as best I can. So why don't we go ahead and take some questions?
Is there going to be another Chinatown tour?
Yes.
Cool. When?
I've done the tour a bunch of times, and we should be. Is there? Yeah.
Well, we can do one. You know, if people request, we could, you know.
Yeah, we'll start it going again, I think, for the season now that the summer's
Just
over.
did one today for Humboldt. Oh.
Yeah, I'm going to bring my students there next month and do the tour for them. And I guess Jeff Crane purchased a tour as part of our fundraiser, but he hasn't gotten in touch with us yet about doing that. But yeah, we'll be starting those up again soon, and it should be advertised on the Eureka Chinatown Project website and Hoppy's website, which are easily found on, you just Google it.
You can talk to the clerk and say, push them a little bit.
Yeah.
And they'll push us.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hey, Rob. So the live stream people can hear you. Use the mic.
Okay.
And you can repeat the question too, since I don't have a mic on the audience.
Oh, I can do that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
What are the plans for a possible restoration or permanent signage or installations around the old Chinatown?
You want to talk about that, Daryl?
Sure.
The signage?
The question was, what about signage? There is signage, but you have to look for it. So for instance, on the side of the Ellis Art Building, there's a sign, there's a big mural, and it shows where the Chinatown was. We also know that there were Chinese in Arcata, so we're working on trying to get signage for that. But I would say the first thing you should look at is the Eureka Chinatown Project under the Hoppy Humboldt. And that we have a brochure which changes as we learn more. Okay, so it's not like, oh, they didn't do a complete job. It's they don't know. You know? So we're always learning. We're always learning more. Okay. For instance, somebody told me the other day that he has some property on the water near the waterfront where he was digging for years, and he'd run into Chinese artifacts. But I haven't like gone to him and say, okay, you know, show me where this is. I did ask him what he did with the artifacts, and he said, I gave them away. So, you know, I mean, that's what happens to history, you know. How many people have picked up a shard somewhere and said, oh, that's just a piece of, you know, broken bowl, you know, kind of thing. And
Hey, Daryl, talk about the monument.
the monument. The monument's going to be on 2nd Street and F. Kitty corner across from the Dick Taylor Chocolate Building. That's an easier one to remember than what the street is. There's a square piece of concrete padding there, and we're working on designing and raising money for the monument that's going there. Okay.
If you would like to donate to the Eureka Chinatown Memorial Project, you can make a donation through Hoppy's website, Eureka Chinatown Project website online, or just scan this QR code into your phone, and you can donate right there.
We have a matching grant, okay, a one-to-one matching grant that we're working on. So now would be a good time to donate because we'll get another $1 for every $1 you donate.
And I think we're about halfway there, is that right?
No.
No. So we need the money. Yeah.
Perhaps with the donations from people attending, we can get to halfway there.
Yeah, right on. Did you have a question? Yeah, here, let me give you the microphone so people can hear you online.
I was given a Chinese chair several years ago by a friend, and she said that there were Chinese people that were doing door-to-door sales. And I'm guessing, and I might be wrong, that this was pre-1885, the expulsion, because I don't know of any door-to-door type sales after people were allowed to come back. And I wanted to know if any of you have ever heard of that kind of thing going on, the door sales.
Of a chair?
Of a chair. I love my chair. Beautiful. I took a picture and then I forgot to bring my phone with me, so I'll send it to Katie. But it's a very nice chair, and she said it was bought by her family members. So that's why we're guessing. And her family'd been here for several generations, so it would be easy for them to have gotten it pre-1885. It could have happened. I wish she'd have told me more.
I don't know about the chair, but I know that my great-great-grandpa Charlie, he came here when he was 11 with a brother, and he was really little, so when they were selecting laborers, they were like, oh, he's too little, we're not going to take him, so he was left behind. But his brother left, and I believe he went to San Francisco. But in the process, years go by, my great-grandmother Bessie had a story where she said when she was growing up that that Grandpa Charlie used to get shipping items from his brother in San Francisco. It had silk and it had different items, and he used to keep them in jars to keep them clean. And so I do believe that there were manufactured products and things that were shipped around from family to family, like in the, I would call it the Chinese economy at the time, is that they did share it, and it made it all the way up to Redwood Creek, or just outside of Blue Lake, and so they had to take it through way before 299 came in. So I can only imagine, taking a horse through there must have been kind of crazy, which surprised me that they'd even put it into glass jars or something to protect it. But there was a lot of silk, and I would imagine that there were chairs, and there was a lot of seamstress, and there were really a lot of crafts made at the time that they were selling. So that's actually really great. Do you have any photos of it, of the chair?
I took a couple photos with my phone, and I forgot my phone. I'll send it. With Katie or Alex, I could send one to each of you.
Okay.
I think I've got both of your addresses.
Cool.
You can't get away.
To the other question about would Chinese do this, go door to door, I think it's fair to say that the Chinese would do what other people would do in any civilization. If they're selling vacuum cleaners, maybe somebody had a Chinese vacuum cleaner salesperson, or chairs, or fuller brush, or you can think about growing up in the 50s and having somebody knocking on the door. Oh, let me show you this, or do you want to buy? And I remember getting married. We got married in 68, and I can remember a fuller brush man coming to me in Baltimore. Okay, so
Yeah, and the thing that got me initially started on this whole research thing was someone had brought in a clay pot that they had found, or they had it in their family for a really long time. And they said, I feel weird continuing to have this in my family. It really belongs in a museum. And it's this just plain looking clay pot, nothing particularly special. It's got like a crack in it. And they were like, yeah, my great-great-grandma, whoever it was, found it in Chinatown. I was like, Chinatown? What are you talking about? There's no Chinatown here. And they were like, well, there was one. And then people salvaged stuff out of it after the expulsion. I was like, what? So that's what got me started in this whole thing. But it's, you know, a part of the Chinese economy, of course, is shipping things in. Those jars, I believe, have been handmade and continue to be handmade by the same company that's made them for hundreds of years. And, you know, they pack them with various foods, ship them over. They'd ship them all throughout Humboldt County, all throughout California in the West, for specialty foods. So something like a chair would, you know, that would be a feasible thing, especially for someone who has expendable income to buy. Yeah.
And you should know that because of the expulsion, all right, people in Humboldt County, when they went, a resident who was raised here told me this story. She said, we were told when we were going to San Francisco, if we went to Chinatown, we were never to say we were from Eureka. Okay? There's a,
My brother told me that too.
in a historical society, there's a story about somebody's written that up, that a merchant found out that they wanted to ship to Eureka, and the merchant basically, or not basically, the merchant folded, closed the book, and said, you know, your business isn't wanted here. So, when we moved here in '75, my mother said, "You be careful up there. Bad things happen to Chinese up there," and so.
I was born in 1951, and my father was born here in 1913, and Mom and Dad and I were mother was Canadian, and so we were driving up to Canada to visit relatives, and this would have been in the mid to late 60s. And we drove from here on up in this, I don't remember where, but we stopped for the night at a kind of cabin motel place, maybe in Washington. And there were, so we had California license plates, and so there was another bunch of people, Asian people at another cabin, California plates. So we started talking, you know, oh, you're California, you know, and Mom and Dad were talking to them and stuff, and they said, so where are you from? And I think they were from San Francisco. And Dad said, oh, we're from Eureka. And they backed off and wouldn't talk to us, and we got really cold really fast, and Mom and Dad were like, what the heck was that, when we were in our own place later. And Dad said, you know, I think it's probably because of the expulsion and that they know about Eureka, and that was in the 60s. So that was always really a big impression for me.
Thanks. Yeah, one thing I've always been interested in tracking down is what were the impressions of the 1885 Eureka expulsion in China, and if there's any documents from the diplomatic side or anything like that about this. But unfortunately, the #1 archives, which is the archives for the Qing dynasty for that era, have been closed for many years. So like a lot of historical research in China, it's getting more difficult to do under the current regime. But Katie, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so that reminded me of a time, one of the kind of early Chinatown tours that we did. You know, we'd meet outside the museum here, and we'd wander around, and it was funny because we always budgeted an hour, and I usually ended up leaving about 3 hours later because we'd do the tour, and then we'd all stand around and chit-chat for a while. And there was a lady and her daughter who joined us on the tour one day, and I think they were from San Francisco. And the mom was saying, like, yeah, you know, my daughters wanted to go to Humboldt State, you know, so we came up here to tour around, and I was kind of looking around like, man, this place is pretty white. There's not a lot of diversity going on here. And she was like, yeah, there's not like there's not like Asian restaurants or stores really. Like, that's kind of weird. And she had somehow, I'm not exactly sure how, but she had stumbled upon something about the expulsion and was like, ooh, okay, I don't know if I want my kid to go to school here. That's a little sketchy. This doesn't seem like a safe place for my kid. And on that particular tour, we had a bunch of people from Hoppy that were with us, and the mom was talking about how, like, yeah, you know, going on this tour kind of confirmed some of my fears, but also it made me aware that there is a community here, first of all, and it's growing, and there's a lot of people that are here to support this positive change. And that's been one of the really meaningful things about being a part of this project, is being able to see that in action. You we share these stories of, removal and expulsion and pain and intergenerational trauma. But to be able to see something come of all that, I think has been really particularly meaningful for me and probably for other people in the group. But yeah, that just made me think of that.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? Valentine, why don't you step forward so the mic can reach you?
I noticed in the presentation or the movie, I think it was somewhere, it was an article saying what happened in Eureka, other Californian cities should do, some article from the 1880s. Do we know of the Eureka expulsion inspiring other Californian cities?
Lots.
Yes, yes. Gene Felser, who wrote the book Driven Out, was cataloging anti-Chinese incidents. Eureka was known as the Eureka example, or the Eureka model, okay? And when she was compiling these anti-Chinese incidents, she was using red dots, and her memory is that she ran out of red dots and she had to go down to Staples to buy more, okay? So, the more you look, the more you're going to find, okay? Tacoma evidently took Eureka as a model for expulsion. Gene Felser mentions the Truckee method, okay? Marysville, okay? There were a number of Chinese communities that were buried when they built the dams, okay? Los Angeles had a lynching in the early 1880s, okay? In the Snake River, 7 Chinese people simply disappeared from a river community. So if you want to know whether we know about them, yeah, we do. We know about a lot of them. And it could even be, we're not even talking about microaggressions, what we call microaggressions. Somebody panhandled me one night when I was with Phyllis, and when I said, no, thank you, he said, nice Caucasian wife you have there. Okay? So, as they say, stuff happens. You never know when it's going to happen. Okay?
Daryl mentioned the Truckee method. That was something that a lot of communities in California and other parts of the West that had anti-Chinese activists who were looking to find ways to get the Chinese people out of their community. A lot of communities went for that method instead of the Eureka method because the Truckee method was basically boycotting. It was saying, every good white citizen needs to sign a pledge that they won't go to any Chinese businesses, they won't employ any Chinese people, they also won't do business with any white people who continue to go to Chinese businesses or continue to employ Chinese themselves. And so a lot of communities figured out after the Wang Hing versus the City of Eureka case was brought, even though that case eventually was not successful for the plaintiffs, it was still seen as evidence that this is dangerous. If you do what Eureka did and just ship the people out, then you're opening yourselves up for lawsuits. But if you just refuse to patronize their businesses and refuse to employ them, that's your personal choice, and so you can't be sued for that. And so a lot more communities ended up going for that boycott method rather than shipping people out.
San Jose's Chinatown was burned down at least twice.
When did and what did it take for that political climate to change, for the Chinese to come back?
First, I'd like to say we've always been here. I want to just chime in because I think that when people say come back, that implies that we left. And that's the same thing for Native Americans. We never did leave, we just were here. And so even though we possess the enrollment in tribes, we still have that Chinese blood and we have always been here. So I just want to say that. No offense.
It's also not the case that Chinese people were allowed to return. Eureka had this unwritten rule that Chinese people weren't allowed to stay here, and it sometimes affected other Asians. Actually, Alex has some good you read her North Coast Journal article on the Japanese. So it wasn't as if suddenly that policy was ended and Chinese people were invited to come to Humboldt County. In fact, Daryl Chin, Ben Chin. This is Daryl Chin. Oh my God, I did it again. Ben Chin moved to Humboldt County and established a restaurant here because there wasn't any Chinese restaurant, and it was a good opportunity, and he was not welcomed.
Somebody actually mentioned to Ben Chin that he might want to start a restaurant here. Okay, you know.
Yes, and so he did, but it wasn't easy, and it so happened that the mayor of Eureka at the time befriended him, liked his food, and that, I think, kind of opened the doors for accommodation. But that kind of political change came slowly, and to this day, there's resistance. I mean, Daryl's mentioned it. My daughter is half Chinese, and we've had a couple of encounters where, strange foods are just weird and not what normal people eat, that kind of thing. She likes seaweed, so get used to it, though. Yeah.
When did Ben Chin open this restaurant?
1959?
No, mid-50s.
Yeah, I think it was like 51 or 52. It's really early 50s anyway.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Canton Cafe, I think that was his first operation, and the family still runs Chin's Cafe down by Pearson Lumber to this day. And, as we all saw during the COVID epidemic back in 2020, these sentiments haven't gone away. They're all still very prominent, and it's sort of reflexive. It's baked into American political culture to attack foreigners. And maybe it won't last forever, but so far it has. So it takes, I guess my point is that it takes someone like Ben Chin, who is brave and willing to put up with this, to kind of break down those barriers. He wasn't invited here and he wasn't welcome when it first happened. But, times have changed somewhat. What do you think, Alex?
In terms of when things really changed, or at least started changing for Chinese Americans in general, World War II, with China and the U.S. being on the same side of the war, it's during that the Chinese Exclusion Act was finally repealed, the act that had initially been, at least an early version of it, put into place in 1882, and then made stronger and more restrictive in 1888, and then again in 1892. And then I think in 1902, thereabouts, it was perpetuated. So it was basically illegal for any Chinese person to come into the country all that time. And it was only in, I think, 1943 that in order to kind of help with the war effort and help with the morale of Chinese and Americans fighting on the same side of the war, that finally the Exclusion Act got repealed. So it's then less than 10 years after that that Ben Chin pioneers his way back pioneers his way into Humboldt County and starts changing the ideas of some people who had never even seen an Asian person, as far as they were aware, in their entire lives.
And similar things happened in Canada, believe it or not. They only got the vote in the 40s.
So,
and just to make one more point about this, I'm sure you all know Brown versus Board of Education that overturned school segregation. Chinese people had been bringing lawsuits like that against various states and school systems for decades before that, including in San Francisco. In fact, it was the Tain family, I think. Tape, thank you. The Tape family sued because their children were being excluded from school in San Francisco, and that led to the establishment of a separate but equal law in California that required the establishment of separate schools for Chinese people, Chinese children. So it's been a long, long struggle, and Chinese people have been struggling for their rights for decades and decades. Daryl mentioned Kim Wong-ark, right?
Wong Kim Ark.
Wong Kim Ark, yeah.
And one thing that we didn't get to in this presentation is that, so there was the expulsion in 85, and then Wing Hing, and then there were a bunch of other expulsions that happened, but one that also happened in later years was down in Port Kenyon. So it's it's called the second expulsion. It was significantly different than the initial one. But following that event, I remember reading an article where the Committee of 15, which was somehow still around, this is what, 1915 at this point? The Committee of 15, which is apparently still around, decides that they're going to have like a specialty like person that hangs out at the port and like checks all the boats if there's any like Chinese people that come aboard or try to come ashore. But I guess just in a nutshell, that particular expulsion event was the cannery that was down in that area brought in some Chinese workers, and they tried to sneak them in under cover of dark using some boxcars connecting the rail line down there. But, you know, small town, word doesn't stay quiet for long, and word got back to Eureka about this group of Chinese workers that was being employed. And there was a group in Eureka that, and Fortuna, I believe, actually, that came down to, you know, talk with Ferndale and try to talk some sense into them. And eventually, you know, Ferndale's like, no, we're not gonna remove these people. We're gonna let them continue to work. But then I think it was the Board of Supervisors decided that they were gonna like stop fishing on the river, like ban fishing on the river. And then the cannery was like, all right, hang on. We don't want to lose all of our money. So they ended up, you know, bowing to the demands of the folks from Eureka and Fortuna, and those individuals were removed. But they got paid for their season of work, even though they had only worked like a week, I think. So kind of an interesting story we didn't touch on here, but at some point there'll be a lot more information about that. Actually, Alex wrote an article on it, right? Yeah.
Yes, and one thing that occurred to me when Rob mentioned, you know, what was the reaction in China? Did they know about it? Were they aware of it? You know, definitely, of course, people were very aware of this. Now, this is only rumor, but it was really striking to me in one of the newspaper articles at the time of this so-called second Chinese expulsion in 1906, when it was talking about, well, there haven't been any Chinese in the county since 1885, supposedly, and so forth. One of these newspaper articles, it was in, I think, the Humboldt Times, it mentioned that, you know, it is said, people have heard, whatever, that Humboldt County and Eureka are so famous or infamous in China that it's basically used as one of these, you know, darn it, kid, you better go to bed, sort of threatening your kid, kind of scary bedrooms, you know, bedtime story, like, you know, the boogeyman will get you or whatever. It says in this newspaper article that parents in China tell their naughty children that if they're not good, they'll be sent to Humboldt County.
I doubt that very much.
I doubt it too. But
it sounds like the kind of thing a Humboldt reporter
exactly.
would say.
But the striking thing to me was that in this article, you know, this was presented as a good thing. This was, you know, we should be proud of the fact that our fame is spread all the way to the Celestial Empire, and children are threatened with Humboldt County. And so me reading this saying, okay, you're proud of this? This makes you happy? Interesting perspective.
In the historical. In the Humboldt Historical Society, they have a big fat folder about the Chinese in Humboldt County, and there's I didn't believe this until I saw it in print. The Humboldt County bragged about attracting people to business, and one of the things that he bragged about was there would be no Chinese to compete for labor. Okay, you can actually go to the Historical Society and see that in a printed.
It says Humboldt County has no agricultural pests, a fine climate, and the only county in the state with no Chinamen.
Yep.
That's from like 1905 or something. I don't think
No, it's even later than that.
Yeah, there was a pamphlet, I think, from 1915.
Speaking of legends, I read in the historian one time that there was a guy who was a kid. He witnessed the mistreatment of the Japanese ambassador coming into Garberville. And the Japanese government used that as a reason to attack us and start World War II. So. But that was, I'm not sure anything come of that.
Yeah. That was listed as one of the causes of the Second World War.
By whom?
By the Japanese.
Oh, the mistreatment of their ambassador coming to Humboldt County. Oh, okay.
Yeah, if you look back at the Humboldt historian from, I think, winter of 2013, I believe is the date. And if you're a member of the Historical Society, you can look at the back issues of the historian online. There is an article that was done by, I'm forgetting the lady's first name, if it's Susan, but somebody McClure, and yeah, it was her father, Bill McClure, who had witnessed in Garberville the Japanese ambassador, Ambassador Debuchy, who was traveling north by car from San Francisco and wanted to see the redwoods. And Bill McClure talked about seeing a bunch of local laborers who had blocked the road and stopped the car and insisted that the ambassador turn back and not be allowed to go through Humboldt County, and various Secret Service guys and so forth who were with him, objected to this and said there's going to be hell to pay back in Washington. And supposedly, from Bill McClure's eyewitness account, these workers who had stopped them finally said, okay, he can get back in the car and you can keep driving north, but he needs to not get out of the car while in Humboldt County. He has to wait till he gets across the Del Norte border. And the actual, details in terms of the proof of this, the documentation, a lot of people are still looking for more evidence. But Bill McClure also said in his reminiscences about it that right after World War II, when he was still in the service, a friend of his came up to him and said, "Hey, you're from Garberville, California, aren't you?" And he said, "Yeah." And this friend showed him a magazine article that said that during the occupation of Japan, a handwritten memo had been found, I think, in some Japanese government official's office. And this memo said that there were like 5 or 7 or something reasons, which were the official reasons why Japan decided to go to war against the United States. And one of those reasons was the mistreatment of the Japanese ambassador in Garberville, California.
If someone ever tracks down the info for that, that would be insane. So, not to commandeer the panel here, but this has been like a marathon panel discussion. I think this is probably the longest Saturday speaker series. I know you had one once that it was like an hour and a half.
And now it's over.
So now it's over.
Thank you very much,
Well
everyone.
done.
Thanks
Thank
to
you.
our panelists. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to those of you who are watching online. Come to our next Saturday speaker series.